On the morning of February 23rd, 1945, a photographer named Joe Rosenthal was struggling to get to the top of a dead volcano on a tiny sulfurous island somewhere between nowhere and Japan. He was short, only 5'5", and he was carrying a bulky speed graphic camera and climbing through loose black volcanic ash that shifted and gave way with every step. He had been told by a photographer coming down the other way that he was too late. The flag was already up, and the moment had already happened. He could turn around and go back down. He didn't. And because he didn't, he ended up capturing what would become arguably the most reproduced and most recognizable photograph of the entire Second World War. A picture so perfect, so geometrically powerful and emotionally immediate that for the rest of his life people would refuse to believe he hadn't staged it. A picture of 6 men, young men, most of them, pressing a long iron pipe into rocky volcanic ground at the top of a 550-foot mountain, while the American flag at the end of it swung up into a gray Pacific sky. But that photograph, as iconic as it is, only tells part of the story. The real story is messier, more complicated, and far more human. It involves 2 flag raisings on the same day, a mountain full of Japanese soldiers who refused to die, one in a series of men whose lives would be upended or ended by a single morning on a patch of rock they'd never heard of 6 months earlier, and a battle that had barely even started when that photo was taken. By the time the island was declared secure, more than 800 Americans would die for every square mile of black volcanic sand. And the men in that photograph, those 6 young men frozen in that perfect moment, 3 of them would not live to see the end of the month. This is the story of the second flag raising on Mount Suribachi, February 23rd, 1945. Sulfur Island, Iwo Jima, is not a place that invites you in. It never was. It sits roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo in a section of the Western Pacific that doesn't have much to recommend it to anyone. The island is only about 8 square miles in total, smaller than Manhattan, smaller than most American towns, roughly the shape of a pork chop if you squint at it from altitude. Its name translates from Japanese as Sulfur Island, which tells you everything you need to know about conditions on the ground. The volcanic rock vented steam through cracks in the earth. The soil smelled of rotten eggs. There was almost no fresh water. The island was, in the words of one Japanese soldier who had been stationed there long enough to form an opinion, a place where no sparrow sings. By early 1945, though, Iwo Jima had become enormously important to both sides, for reasons that had nothing to do with its appeal as a destination and everything to do with its geography. Located almost exactly halfway between the American bomber bases in the Mariana Islands and the Japanese home islands, Iwo Jima sat directly astride the flight path that B-29 superfortresses were using for their long-range bombing raids against Japan. Japanese fighters stationed on the island's 3 airfields could intercept and harass those bombers on their way in and out. Japanese radar operators on the island could radio warnings ahead, giving Japanese air defenses precious extra minutes to scramble. Every time a B-29 formation flew toward Japan, Iwo Jima watched them go and told Japan they were coming. For the Americans, capturing the island would do three things at once. It would eliminate that early warning station and those interceptor aircraft. It would provide a staging base for long-range fighter escorts, P-51 Mustangs, that could accompany the bombers all the way to Japan and back. And it would give damaged B-29 somewhere to put down in an emergency rather than ditching in open ocean. American planners estimated that hundreds of B-29 crewmen might survive the war specifically because of emergency landings at Iwo Jima. That calculation would later prove largely correct, and a damaged B-29 named Dynamite made the first emergency landing on a captured Iwo Jima airfield on March 4, 1945, while the battle was still raging around it. Eventually, over 2,000 B-29s would use the island as an emergency landing site during the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. None of that was visible in the planning stages. What was visible to the Americans was a strategic necessity. What was visible to the Japanese was the same thing, and they had spent nearly a year preparing accordingly. The fortress underground. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was not a man who surrendered easily to the obvious. When he arrived on Iwo Jima in the summer of 1944 to take command of its defense, most Japanese military thinking still favored meeting an enemy amphibious assault at the shoreline, massing firepower at the water's edge, destroying the invaders before they could establish a beachhead. Kuribayashi had studied American military tactics carefully enough to know that approach was almost certainly futile. American naval firepower was simply too overwhelming. A beach defense would be shattered before it could fire a shot. His solution was to go underground, literally. Kuribayashi ordered his engineers to begin tunneling into the volcanic rock beneath Iwo Jima on a scale that had never been attempted before. By the time the Americans arrived in February 1945, roughly 11 miles of tunnels had been dug beneath the island's surface, connecting bunkers, caves, artillery positions, command posts, barracks, and ammunition stores in an interconnected system that sat as deep as 75 feet below ground. Hundreds of hidden artillery emplacements were positioned so that every inch of Iwo Jima fell within range of Japanese fire. Machine gun nests and sniper positions were camouflaged into the volcanic rock with extraordinary care. Kuribayashi had issued what he called his courageous battle vows to every man under his command. Each soldier was expected to kill 10 Americans before dying. They were expected to hold their positions to the last man. They were expected to treat their defensive posts as their graves, because that is what they would become. And the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima numbered somewhere around 22,000 men when the battle began. Nearly all of them would die there. Kuribayashi's strategy was not to defeat the Americans. He knew that was impossible. His goal was to make the cost of victory so appalling that the American public would recoil from the prospect of invading the Japanese home islands. He wanted to buy time and inflict maximum casualties, and he was very, very good at it. The months of American naval and aerial bombardment before the invasion had done almost nothing to this underground fortress. From the surface, and it looked as though the shelling had torn the island apart. Beneath the surface, Kuribayashi's men had simply waited it out, deep in their tunnels, and then climbed back to their positions when the bombardment stopped. Black sand, black morning. At 8:59 on the morning of February 19, 1945, 1 minute ahead of schedule, the first wave of American Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima's southeastern coast. The opening was quiet in a way that should have been alarming. There was light fire, a few casualties, but nothing like the wall of steel that everyone had expected. The Marines began moving inland, and for a few brief, deceiving minutes, it seemed like the preliminary bombardment might actually have done its job. Then the Japanese opened fire from everywhere at once. Kuribayashi had positioned his weapons specifically to allow the beaches to fill with men and equipment before detonating the trap. Mortars and artillery opened up from concealed positions all over the island. Machine guns that had been invisible minutes earlier now poured fire from the ridgelines and hillsides. The soft volcanic ash of the beaches, which had already bogged down men and equipment. Marines sank to their ankles with every step, and vehicles simply refused to move, now became a killing ground with nowhere to shelter. The embankments of ash rose 15 feet high in places, and when men crowded against them while fire came in from seemingly every direction. Within hours of the first landing, the beaches of Iwo Jima had become one of the most chaotic and deadly scenes in the entire Pacific War. Equipment piled up in the surf. Landing craft were destroyed by enemy fire and by the violent surf. Men died on the sand without ever making it 20 yards from the water. By the end of the first day, despite the carnage, 30,000 Marines had made it ashore. But they had paid for every yard, and they had barely started. One of the men who landed on February 19th was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, a Marine who had already earned the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal in 1942, and who had turned down a safe stateside posting to return to combat. Basilone personally led his machine gun section across the beach, knocked out a Japanese blockhouse that was blocking the advance, and guided a vulnerable tank through a minefield under sustained enemy fire. Moments after doing all of that, a Japanese mortar round killed him. He was 28 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. The 28th Marine Regiment, which would be responsible for the capture of Mount Suribachi at the island's southern tip, landed on the southernmost beaches and immediately began the grueling work of cutting the volcano off from the rest of the island. Suribachi dominated everything to its north and east, From its 550-foot summit, Japanese observers could direct artillery fire onto the entire American beachhead. As long as it was in Japanese hands, every American on that island was operating under direct observation from above. Taking it was the first priority. 4 days. The fight to reach the base of Suribachi and begin the assault on the mountain took 4 days. 4 days of the kind of fighting that Marines later described in terms that stripped everything else away. Short sentences, flat effect, as though the words themselves couldn't bear the full weight of what happened. Every yard of ground had to be taken by hand. Every cave and bunker had to be reduced individually, usually with grenades and flamethrowers and demolition charges. The Japanese didn't surrender. They fought from their positions until they were dead. And when one man was killed, the position was often still occupied by others deeper in the tunnel system. You could silence a pillbox, walk past it, and take fire from it again 10 minutes later. By February 22nd, and the 28th Marines had completely isolated the base of Suribachi from the rest of the island. The volcano was surrounded. The Marines held the perimeter below, and above them, dug into the rocky slopes and the crater rim of the extinct volcano, Japanese soldiers waited. In the early morning hours of February 23rd, the regiment sent a 40-man patrol up the mountain to probe the defenses and see whether the summit could be reached. The patrol was commanded by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier, and among those who volunteered to go up with him was a photographer from Leatherneck magazine named Staff Sergeant Lewis Lowry. They climbed through the volcanic rock and loose ash, moving carefully, expecting to take fire at any moment. They didn't. The summit of Mount Suribachi was largely undefended. The Japanese who had been in the crater area were either dead deep in their caves or had abandoned the position during the night. Out by around 10:20 in the morning, Schreier's patrol had reached the top of the mountain. The first flag. Someone had thought to bring a flag. It had come from the USS Missoula, one of the ships offshore, donated by a Navy veteran named Tom Price, who would later recall it as one of the proudest moments he could think of, handing that flag to a lieutenant who was going to carry it to the top. The flag was small, 54 by 28 inches, about the size of a large bath towel. Sergeant Ernest Thomas, Sergeant Henry Hansen, Corporal Charles Lindbergh, pharmacist's mate John Bradley, and several others grabbed a piece of water pipe they found near the summit, attached the flag to it with whatever was at hand, and raised it at around 10:30 in the morning. Lowry photographed the moment as the flag went up. The reaction below was immediate and extraordinary. Marines on the beaches and slopes, as sailors on ships offshore, anyone with eyes on the summit of Suribachi, could see that tiny patch of red, white, and blue appearing against the gray sky. The response from below was something that people who were there never forgot. Ships blew their horns, men shouted until they were hoarse. Marines who had been fighting and dying in black volcanic ash for 4 days, men who were exhausted, frightened, grieving, stopped and looked up and cheered. The cheering rolled across the island. And the Japanese saw it too, and their response was fire. Almost immediately after the flag went up, a burst of enemy shooting came in around the Marines on the summit. A Japanese soldier emerged from a cave on the crater rim and threw a grenade at the group. Lowry dived for cover, rolling down the steep side of the mountain and breaking his camera in the process. He headed back down to get new equipment, and on his way down, he passed 3 people coming up: Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, Marine combat photographer Sergeant Bill Gnaust with his movie camera, and Private First Class Bob Campbell. Lowry stopped and told Rosenthal that the flag was already up. He'd missed it. The moment was gone. The second flag. Back at the base of the mountain, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, had been watching the flag go up and thinking. He had seen the reaction. He had seen the ships blowing their horns and heard the men cheering. He understood what a larger flag, one that every man on the island could clearly see, one that could be seen from the northern end of the island where the fighting was still the worst, might mean for morale. He also wanted to preserve the first flag, which was a small battalion-issue flag. The Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, had actually come ashore that morning specifically to witness the raising on Suribachi, and Johnson suspected the first flag might end up as someone's souvenir. Johnson ordered a replacement. A larger flag was found, 96 inches by 56 inches, nearly 8 feet long and almost 5 feet wide, retrieved from a tank landing ship, the USS LST 779. Johnson dispatched his battalion runner, Private First Class René Gagnon, to carry the flag up to the summit with a message for Schreier: raise this one, send the other one down. Gagnon joined Sergeant Michael Strank, a 25-year-old squad leader from Easy Company, who had been ordered to ascend with 3 of his men, Corporal Harlan Block and privates, First Class Franklin Sousley and Ira Hayes. They were also tasked with laying telephone wire to the summit on the way up. Joining them at the top would be Private First Class Harold Schultz and Private First Class Harold Keller. 6 men total would raise the second flag. They reached the summit around noon. The first flag was still flying. Rosenthal, Gnaust, and Campbell were there by now. They had continued up after talking to Lowry, and Rosenthal had decided there might still be something worth photographing. He wasn't sure what exactly. He started clearing rocks to stand on. He was too short to see clearly otherwise, and watching. Strank gave his men instructions in his typical way: calm, direct, no unnecessary words. The plan was to raise the large flag simultaneously with the lowering of the smaller one. The men found a piece of pipe, an iron Japanese water pipe, and Gagnon gave Strank the flag, and Strank reportedly said to Lieutenant Schreier, "Colonel Johnson wants this big flag run up high so every son of a bitch on this whole cruddy island can see it." Rosenthal had his camera up. Gnaust, standing to his left, asked if he was in the way. Rosenthal turned to answer, and as he turned, he realized the Marines were already raising the flag. and he swung his speed graphic camera around without looking through the viewfinder, pressed the shutter at 1/400th of a second, and captured the image. He didn't know what he had. The 6 men, Strank at the back, Block with his hands near the ground, Sousley behind him, Hayes on the far left, Schultz and Keller, drove the pipe into the rocky volcanic soil and felt it stand. The wind caught the flag and it flew out behind them, full and visible, over the summit of Mount Suribachi. Janoust's movie camera captured the whole thing in real time, an unbroken sequence that would later prove definitively that the photograph was not staged, that those men actually raised that flag on that afternoon, exactly as the image shows. No one on the summit thought much of it at the time. It was a logistical task, not a ceremony. They were in the middle of one of the bloodiest battles in the history of the Marine Corps. There was no pause. There was no speech. The flag went up. They made sure it was secure. Schultz and Keller added rocks around the base and 3 guy ropes against the wind. And then they went back to the war. The photo, nobody believed was real. Joe Rosenthal sent his undeveloped film back by seaplane to the Associated Press Bureau in Guam. He didn't wait to see what had developed. He had other pictures to take. The roll went out, was processed, and a photo editor at the AP in New York saw the image for the first time and immediately recognized what it was. The photograph appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the United States on Sunday, February 25, 1945, 2 days after it was taken. The reaction was unlike anything that had happened with a news photograph before. By the end of that week, it had been published in hundreds of newspapers and magazines. Requests for prints came in by the thousands. The AP's Hal Buell later said that among those who saw the picture immediately, there was an unambiguous, almost physical sense that this was something that had never quite been photographed before. It was also, from almost the beginning, questioned. The controversy grew from a misunderstanding that Rosenthal himself accidentally helped create. A few days after the photograph was taken, he had gathered the Marines of Easy Company and taken a group shot, what the men called the gung-ho shot, posed and cheerful, with the raised flag visible in the background. When someone asked him back on Guam whether he had posed the photograph, Rosenthal thought they were asking about the group shot and said yes. A Time Life correspondent named Robert Sherrod heard this, assumed Rosenthal was talking about the flag raising, and filed a report saying Rosenthal had staged the iconic image after the flag was already up. The accusation followed Rosenthal for the rest of his life. It was wrong, and the movie footage shot by Sergeant Janoust simultaneously with Rosenthal's photograph shows the flag going up in real time, an unbroken living sequence that matches the still image exactly. The men who were there confirmed it repeatedly. Robert Sherrod himself eventually admitted he had been wrong, but the rumor proved impossible to kill, and Rosenthal spent 60 years defending a photograph that required no defense. He died in 2006 at the age of 94, still occasionally having to explain that he hadn't staged anything. that the image was real, that those men actually raised that flag in exactly the way the picture shows. What he had captured, largely by instinct, in a fraction of a second, without looking through his viewfinder, was one of the most compositionally perfect images in the history of photography: the diagonal thrust of the flagpole. The 6 men arranged in a natural triangle, on the flag unfurling at the apex, the rocky broken summit that speaks to what it cost to get there. A photo editor at the AP said something at the time that has never quite been improved upon. It has the ring of inevitability, as though the moment had always looked exactly like this and always would. The photograph would win the 1945 Pulitzer Prize for Photography, the only photograph ever to win the prize in the same year it was taken. 6 men. The men in that photograph were not famous before the picture was taken. They were just Marines, young men from across America, thrown together by the particular machinery of war, climbing a volcanic mountain because they were ordered to, with a flag they'd been handed and a length of pipe they'd found. Sergeant Michael Strank was the oldest of them. He was 25, born in Czechoslovakia, and raised in the coal country of Franklinborough, Pennsylvania, where his immigrant father had come to work in the steel mills. He had joined the Marine Corps in 1939, before the war, before Pearl Harbor, simply because it seemed like a good path forward for a young man in a steel town during the Depression. He was, by the accounts of every man who served under him, the kind of leader that military institutions spend decades trying to create and almost never do. He used humor. He stayed calm. He told his men, "Follow me, and then I'll try to bring you all safely home to your mothers." He refused a promotion so he could stay with the men he'd trained with. He was the oldest man in his platoon, the veteran who steadied everyone else. He raised that second flag on February 23, 1945. On March 1, 1945, a shell, almost certainly fired by an American destroyer offshore, tore through his chest and killed him instantly. He was 25. He died not knowing that his image had already made him a national symbol. Corporal Harlan Block was from Weslaco, Texas, from the kind of place where football is religion and the Friday night lights matter more than almost anything else. He had been a star end on his high school team, the kind of athlete who has his whole trajectory laid out in front of him. He enlisted in the Marine Corps the day his team won the state championship. His teammates went back to school Monday morning, and Block reported for duty. In the famous photograph, he is the man closest to the ground, driving the base of the pipe into the volcanic rock with his whole body. He was killed on March 1st, 1945, the same day as Strank, by a Japanese mortar explosion. Private First Class Franklin Sousley was from Flemingsburg, Kentucky, dairy country, a soft-spoken 19-year-old who, by some accounts, was something of a joker, a kid who could lighten any room, who had an easy grin and a gift for making the men around him laugh, even when there was nothing funny about their situation. He died on March 21st, 1945, hit by Japanese sniper fire. He was 19 years old. Private First Class Ira Hayes was Pima Indian born in 1923 on the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona. He had trained as a Marine parachutist before being assigned to the 28th Marines for the Iwo Jima campaign. He was, by every description, a quiet man, a good Marine, as someone who did his job and looked after the men around him. He survived the battle. When the photograph was identified and the surviving flag raisers were pulled out of the Pacific Campaign to participate in the 7th War Lone Drive back home, Hayes was among them. The fame undid him. He was not comfortable with being called a hero. The men he considered heroes were the ones who hadn't come back, and there were a lot of them from his platoon. He was arrested 52 times for public intoxication in the years after the war. And he walked and hitchhiked 1,300 miles across the Southwest in 1946 to reach the family of Harlan Block and tell them personally that their son was in the photograph, that the Marine officially identified as someone else was actually Harlan Block, and they deserved to know. He died on January 24, 1955, at the age of 32, from exposure and alcohol poisoning, found in a ditch near his home on the reservation. Private First Class Harold Schultz and Private First Class Harold Keller, also in the photograph, were not publicly identified as flag raisers until 2016 and 2019, respectively, after decades of misidentification and confusion about exactly who was in the image. Schultz was identified in June 2016 after a Marine Corps review determined that he, not another Marine, occupied one of the positions previously attributed to someone else. Keller's identification came in October 2019. Both men went through their post-war lives largely anonymous. Their role in one of the most famous photographs in history, publicly unknown for more than 7 decades. Private First Class René Gagnon, who carried the flag to the summit, survived the battle, participated in the war bond tour, and spent much of the rest of his life struggling to leverage his association with the image into something stable. It never quite worked. He held a series of jobs: airline ticket agent, travel agency proprietor, maintenance director at an apartment complex, and died in 1979 at the age of 54. These were not extraordinary men in extraordinary circumstances who behaved extraordinarily. They were ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances who behaved like Marines, which means they did what they were told. They looked after each other, and they kept going forward until they couldn't. Or what the photo did. 2 days after the photograph appeared in American newspapers, President Franklin Roosevelt saw it. He immediately understood its potential in the way that great politicians understand such things, not cynically, but practically, with a clear sense of what a nation at war needs and when it needs it. He ordered the surviving flag raisers identified and brought to Washington as soon as the battle was over. By the time the 7th War Lone Drive kicked off in May 1945, 3 of the 6 men in the photograph were dead on Iwo Jima. The 3 survivors, Gagnon, Hayes, and John Bradley, the Navy corpsman who had been mistakenly identified as a flag raiser. He was present at the first raising and the second, though later Marine Corps Review concluded he was not among the 6 in Rosenthal's image, toured the country. They appeared at rallies, at bond drives, in newspapers, and on radio broadcasts, on posters drawn by artist C.C. Beale, based on Rosenthal's photograph, with the words, "Now, all together," printed beneath the image. They became the faces of the final push to fund the war. The 7th War Loan Drive raised $26.3 billion, twice its stated goal. The photograph itself was printed on 3.5 million posters. It appeared on postage stamps. It was reproduced in butter and ice and corn mazes and Lego bricks and every other medium imaginable. It became, in a relatively short time, less a photograph of a specific event than a kind of visual shorthand for the entire concept of American military effort and sacrifice, something that people recognized before they could consciously identify what they were looking at. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of all U.S. naval forces in the Pacific, said of the men who fought on Iwo Jima, "Among the men who fought on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue." It is one of the most quoted lines to come out of the entire Pacific War. It's a good line. But what it describes, uncommon valor as a common virtue, is exactly what Rosenthal's photograph shows. Not one extraordinary man, 6 ordinary men, together, doing a job. The battle goes on. On the island, the flag going up on Suribachi changed nothing militarily. The battle had barely started. Suribachi was the southernmost point of Iwo Jima, and the vast majority of the Japanese defenders were in the north, dug into the island's most rugged and difficult terrain, the canyons and ridgelines and cave systems of the northern plateau, where Kuribayashi had concentrated his main defensive lines. For the Marines who weren't on that mountain, who were still fighting yard by yard through volcanic rock and ash, the sight of the flag was a tremendous morale boost. But it changed nothing about the next morning's work. The next morning, they still had to go forward. They still had to go into the positions that needed to be cleared, one, by fire and grenades and flamethrowers, with men dying in every action. The places where they fought earned names over those weeks that told you everything about the nature of the battle. There was an area called the Meat Grinder, where nearly 850 Marines died, taking a fortified position that the Japanese defended with every available means. There was Bloody Gorge, where the final Japanese defenders made their last stand. There was the amphitheater, and the Turkey Knob, and Hill 362, and dozens of other pieces of volcanic rock that cost lives measured in hundreds for gains measured in yards. By the time the island was declared secure on March 26, 1945, the final toll was staggering. Close to 6,821 American servicemen had been killed. More than 19,000 were wounded. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, only around 200 were taken prisoner. The rest were dead. This was, at the time, one of the few battles in the Pacific War in which American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese, a fact that horrified military planners and civilian leaders alike, and that cast a long shadow over the decisions that would be made about how to end the war with Japan. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions during the Battle of Iwo Jima, more than for any other single engagement in American military history. Nearly half of them were awarded posthumously. Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Sergeant Bill Genaust, who filmed the second flag raising with his movie camera and whose footage proved the photograph's authenticity. He was killed on March 4th, 1945, inside a cave 9 days after the moment he had captured on film. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, who had ordered the second flag raised, killed in action on March 2nd. The men who made the photograph possible kept dying after it was taken. The memorial. In the immediate aftermath of the photograph's publication, a Navy petty officer named Felix de Weldon saw the image at a naval air station in Maryland. De Weldon was an Austrian-born sculptor who had trained in Vienna and come to America before the war. He stared at the photograph for what he later described as a very long time, and then he reached for sculptor's clay and tools and began to work. He could see, in the diagonal thrust of the flagpole and the reaching arms of the men and the triangular arrangement of their bodies, something that resonated with the classical sculpture he had studied in Europe, the same structural principles that had made great works of art endure. He worked through the weekend and produced a small model. He was commissioned by the U.S. Congress in 1951 to create the full-scale sculpture. He spent 3 years building a 32-foot plaster master model, working from photographs and from 3 of the surviving flag raisers who posed for him in person. The plaster original was then disassembled into 108 individual pieces, transported to Brooklyn, New York, for bronze casting, and reassembled in Arlington, Virginia. The finished memorial stands 78 feet tall, the figures themselves 32 feet high, and weighs 100 tons, making it the largest bronze statue in the world. President Dwight D. Eisenhower dedicated the United States Marine Corps War Memorial on November 10, 1954, the 179th anniversary of the founding of the Marine Corps. Ira Hayes was there that day. He stood in his suit in front of the bronze image of himself and 5 other men, the image frozen at the moment that had changed everything about the rest of his life, and he watched the ceremony. Less than 3 months later, he was dead. The memorial stands today where it has stood since 1954, and in Arlington Ridge Park, just outside Arlington National Cemetery, looking out over the Potomac toward Washington. People come from all over the world to see it. Most of them know the photograph it came from. Not all of them know the names of the men in it. Strank, Block, Sousley, Hayes, Schultz, Keller. 3 dead before the battle was even over. 3 who survived to live with what came after. The flag that Rosenthal photographed, the large 96 by 56-inch flag that Gagnon carried to the summit, that Strank's men drove into the volcanic rock of Mount Suribachi, still exists. It is on display at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. It is frayed at the edges, a little faded from 80 years. It is exactly the flag in the photograph. What it means. The second flag, raising on Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, took place in under a minute. 6 men and a length of iron pipe and a flag that was too big to fly quietly or go unnoticed. Nobody on the summit thought it was especially significant at the time. It was a logistical replacement, bigger flag for smaller flag, so the men on the far side of the island could see it. Joe Rosenthal had no idea he had taken one of the most important photographs in history when he handed his film to the seaplane courier and went back to work. The men in the photograph went back to fighting, and 3 of them never went home. The battle continued for another 5 weeks, costing thousands more lives, and the island that 6,821 Americans died for was eventually handed back to Japan in 1968. None of that diminishes what happened on that mountain. The men who fought and died on Iwo Jima did so because they were asked to, because the mission mattered, and because the men around them needed them to keep going. Oh, the photograph that came from that mountain captured something real. Not a posed moment, not a manufactured symbol, but 6 young men doing a simple, physical task at the highest point of a terrible battlefield, and a flag opening against the sky above them. Fleet Admiral Nimitz was right. Uncommon valor was a common virtue on Iwo Jima. And Joe Rosenthal, in 1/400th of a second, without looking through his viewfinder, caught that truth at the exact moment it needed to be caught. If this story reached you, if you felt something about those 6 young men on that mountain, or about the 6,821 who never left the island, hit the like button. It helps more people find these stories, and these stories deserve to be found. Subscribe and turn the bell on so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you have a family connection to Iwo Jima, a grandfather, an uncle, someone from your community who was there, leave their name in the comments. Their names matter. They still do.